The sky had burned red for 3 days before the humans realized it wasn't just a storm, but the arrival of something far worse than weather. Vessels like obsidian daggers pierced the atmosphere, and from them came creatures built like nightmares, yet moved like dancers, armored in metal that looked like liquid shadow. The first human cities fell before the alarm could even be sounded. In the chaos, soldiers were captured, some killed, some taken as trophies by the invaders who called themselves the Valkyrans. Among them was one feared name, Commander Zalari. She was unlike the others, taller, colder, her skin the color of twilight, and her voice sharp enough to cut steel. She led every assault with unshaken confidence, and though her army saw her as divine, none ever saw her bleed, stumble, or hesitate, until the day she took a human prisoner for reasons no one around her could explain. He wasn't a high-ranking officer or a known hero, just one man from the battlefield who had shielded a child from a falling beam and gotten caught when reinforcements failed to arrive. His name was Mason, and he woke inside a cold cell not with chains, but with silence, and a pair of glowing violet eyes staring at him from the shadows. Commander Zalari watched him often, never speaking much, only observing, as if trying to understand something, even she didn't recognize. Mason noticed that she never turned her back to anyone, not even her own guards, and always stood with tension in her shoulders like a storm waiting to break. The other aliens whispered in their strange tongue, wondering why their commander spent so much time near a human who had done nothing special. What they didn't know, and what Mason didn't realize until later, was that Zalari's time with him wasn't about interrogation or dominance. It was about watching something she never understood before: kindness. The way he shared his food with injured captives. The way he sat with a dying enemy soldier and spoke to him until the breath faded. Mason didn't ask for freedom, didn't scream for rescue. He listened and remembered. And that made him more dangerous than any warrior. One night, the base was hit by a quake from the planet's unstable core, and the lights flickered out. The ground cracked and some of the corridors collapsed, separating parts of the camp and cutting communication. Mason's cell door opened by accident, but instead of running, he checked the others and tried to help those who were hurt. He followed the sound of crumbling stone and found her, Zalari, trapped under a collapsed pillar with blood trickling down her temple and her hand crushed beneath armor. She looked at him not with command but with pain, like a person who was tired of pretending to be made of iron. Without a word, Mason approached, lifted debris with trembling arms, and freed her slowly, expecting at any moment to be stabbed. But she didn't reach for her weapon. She only stared at him in disbelief, then looked away quickly as if ashamed. Her breath caught, and for a second he saw it. Not a leader, not a legend, but a woman on the edge of breaking. A tear rolled down her cheek and she turned her face from him like it burned her to be seen. "You didn't see that," she said, voice hoarse, trying to hide the weakness even in that small moment. "I saw someone in pain," Mason replied simply, "and I helped because that's what people do." She didn't answer right away, but her fingers clenched and she seemed to struggle with something deeper than wounds. "If you speak of this, you lose your tongue," she warned, eyes cold again, but not hateful. "I never saw anything," Mason said, offering his hand to help her stand. For the first time in years, Zalari took it not out of need, but out of choice. Something had shifted, and though neither of them said it, they both knew that moment could never be undone. Behind the walls of the alien base, while others still saw a cruel commander and a silent captive, a secret now bound them tighter than chains. And secrets like that always change everything. Asterisk. The night after the quake, silence held the base like a breath, trapped in a chest full of fear and dust. Mason sat quietly in his corner of the ruined cell, his back against a cracked pillar while his mind replayed every second of what he had witnessed. Zalari had shown something no one else believed she could: vulnerability. He had kept his word and spoken to no one, not even the other prisoners, who stared at him with silent questions. The guards were too busy rebuilding and restoring power to notice or care what he did, as long as he didn't escape. Still, Mason felt the weight of what he carried, and it was heavier than chains. Across the damaged hallways, Zalari stood at the edge of the command chamber. Her fingers pressed tightly against a console that no longer worked. She had ordered her medics to leave her alone and had wrapped her damaged hand herself. Though her movements were slower than usual, her thoughts were a storm she could not. Silence, and it wasn't the injury that left her shaken. It was the way Mason had looked at her, with no judgment, no fear, only quiet understanding. That was more dangerous than any weapon a human could wield, because it reached past her armor and into the place she buried long ago. She had trusted no one since her blood sister died in the wars of purity. Yet now her silence had been pierced by a simple act of mercy. She walked alone through the wreckage until she reached the detention area again, where Mason remained still, his eyes closed but not asleep. Her shadow fell across him, and he opened his eyes slowly, giving her a nod instead of rising. "You didn't tell anyone," she said, voice flat but cautious, like she wasn't sure why she needed to say it aloud. "I said I wouldn't," Mason replied, his voice calm but not submissive. Zalari lowered herself onto a broken crate, the metal groaning under her weight as if protesting her choice to sit instead of command. "I've executed soldiers for less," she added, watching him carefully. "And yet here I am," he said, his eyes locked on hers with no trace of mockery. A long pause stretched between them, filled only by the soft hiss of broken steam pipes and the distant thrum of emergency lights. She hated the feeling in her chest, the one she couldn't name, the one that tightened when he spoke like an equal. It reminded her too much of the person she used to be before she became a symbol of fear. "You confuse the others," she said at last, shifting her gaze away as if the sight of him unsettled something. "They don't know what. I'm still trying to understand myself." Mason remained silent, giving her the space she clearly didn't ask for but somehow needed. After a moment, she continued, her voice softer, as if each word betrayed her discipline. "In my world, leaders cannot be seen grieving, bleeding, or doubting, especially not in front of a human. But what if showing it makes you more real to the ones who follow?" Mason asked gently. Zalari's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed like she might rise and walk away. Instead, she stayed and let his questions sit between them, like a challenge neither of them dared to answer. They met again the next day, and the day after that, with no chains and no threats, only quiet conversations beneath the veil of secrecy. Zalari asked about Earth, its seasons, its sounds, its people, and Mason told her stories of oceans and cities lit by neon and songs sung around campfires. He never asked about her past, and she never offered it, but her silence began to soften in his presence. She started smiling once, but caught herself and turned away, pretending her lips had twitched from pain. Mason noticed, but said nothing, storing that image in his mind like something sacred. Trust, once impossible, had started to bloom in the space where fear used to sit, but they both knew it couldn't last forever. Not in a war zone where eyes watched and ears waited for weakness to strike. Zalari stood one morning in front of the High Council's envoy, who had arrived unannounced to inspect the camp. The visitors questioned her leadership, whispered about her injuries, and asked why the human was still alive. She answered with authority and composure, but Mason could see from the shadows that her grip on control was slipping, and when their eyes met across the hall, both of them understood something dangerous had begun to take root. A bond that defied the rules of war was forming in secret, and secrets in a place like this never stayed buried for long. The council's visit had unsettled Zalari more than any battlefield ever could. They brought no armies, no ships, no weapons, just words sharpened into blades meant to cut beneath her armor. They smiled with hollow eyes and asked why a human prisoner was still breathing in her camp. They reminded her that mercy was not a trait written in the Valkyran Code of Command. Zalari gave them the same answer she always did: discipline, control, and strategy. But for the first time, her voice lacked the fire they expected. And for that alone, they began to doubt her strength. Mason had seen those council members once from behind a security shield, and their presence sent a cold shiver through him. They weren't soldiers or warriors, but something worse: politicians bred to wield power without honor. He didn't understand all their words, but he understood their tone, the way they looked at Zalari, as if she were now a broken tool. When she returned from their meeting, her steps were heavier and her silence deeper. He wanted to ask what they said, but held back, knowing the look in her eyes wasn't one that invited questions. Instead, he simply waited in the dim cell until she came to him on her own. That night, she stood at the edge of his chamber and stared through the force field without saying a word. Her arms were crossed and her breathing was steady, but something in her expression looked tired. Mason stepped forward, close enough for her to hear him clearly, but not close enough to threaten the space between them. "They don't like that I'm still alive," he said softly, more observation than accusation. Zalari didn't move, but the flicker in her eyes confirmed everything he suspected. "They think you've gone soft," he added, not mockingly, but with quiet truth. She deactivated the field and stepped inside, her boots echoing against the metal floor. "They think I've lost control," she said coldly, though her voice wavered just once. Mason didn't reply right away, watching her face carefully, the sharp lines now shadowed by uncertainty. "You haven't," he said finally. "You're still in charge of every room you enter." She turned away, her back to him, but didn't leave. Instead, she said something he never thought he'd hear. "I have to prove I can still be feared," she whispered. He stepped closer, heart pounding, unsure if this was a trap or the unraveling of a wall she had built since childhood. "What does that mean?" he asked cautiously. "It means someone has to bleed," she replied without emotion. He swallowed hard, knowing what came next, the weight of it settling in the space between them like smoke. "They want it to be you," she said at last, turning to face him again. Her eyes glowed with something he couldn't name. Not rage, not sorrow, but the echo of both. Mason didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't even look surprised. "I figured that was coming," he said, his voice calm like always. "But you're not going to do it," he added, watching her closely. She didn't deny it, didn't confirm it either, and that silence told him more than words ever could. Her conflict wasn't with the council, it was with herself. That night, she called for a public display, a warrior's judgment, a spectacle to reassure the council of her dominance. The arena was lit by artificial moons and lined with soldiers who came to see punishment. Mason stood in the center, hands unbound, as Zalari approached in full battle armor. Her face was unreadable, her blade glowing with electric venom as protocol demanded. She raised it high, and the crowd cheered, their faith in her reign restored by the coming strike. But then her blade stopped an inch from his skin, and she lowered it slowly. The gasps echoed across the Colosseum, like thunder in a silent forest. "She has spared him," someone shouted in disbelief, followed by the murmurs of confusion and betrayal. Zalari raised her hand to silence them and looked around the crowd with burning eyes. "This human saved my life," she declared, her voice shaking the pillars. "And I will not repay that debt with blood." The council elders stood frozen, caught between outrage and uncertainty as her words spread like wildfire. In that moment, she made a choice no Valkyrian commander had made before her. The consequences would be severe, and she knew that. But as she walked away from the arena with Mason at her side, she felt lighter than she had in years. The crowd watched in silence, not knowing whether to cheer or curse. As history shifted before their eyes, inside her something unfamiliar but powerful had begun to awaken. Not weakness, not shame, but something stronger than both. Conviction. Asterisk. The aftermath of the arena left the base in a haze of silence and tension that hung heavier than smoke. No one dared to speak against Commander Zalari openly. But whispers filled the corridors like static in a broken transmission. The council returned to their ship with stiff posture and unreadable faces, leaving behind orders that felt more like veiled threats. Zalari received no punishment, but her authority had been quietly placed under scrutiny. The weight of tradition pressed down on her. But the choice she had made in front of them could not be taken back, and Mason, still alive and walking beside her, was now more than a prisoner. He was a symbol of her defiance. The soldiers saluted her as always, but their eyes lingered too long, and their silence felt sharp. Among them, some watched Mason with confusion, while others watched him with resentment. To them, he had not earned survival, he had been gifted it, and that made him dangerous in a different way. Zalari noticed the shift but said nothing, walking with a calm that dared anyone to challenge her decision. Mason followed her lead, knowing each step he took was a gamble in a game he barely understood. Still, he didn't shrink beneath the weight of their stares. He met them with quiet dignity. Inside her command chamber, Zalari sat alone and removed her armor piece by piece. Her damaged hand trembled as she unclasped the chest plate, revealing deep bruises and healing scars. She had fought hundreds of battles, but this one, against her own people's expectations, cut the deepest. Her reflection in the mirror no longer looked like a conqueror or a legend. It looked like a woman who had dared to choose something for herself rather than the Empire. And now she had to live with what that choice would cost her. Mason entered after a brief knock, stepping in without waiting for her permission. She didn't yell or raise a weapon, just looked at him with tired eyes. "You realize they'll never forget what happened," he said, keeping his voice low. "They already send messages to your fleet, questioning your judgment, your discipline, even your bloodline." Zalari nodded, unsurprised, but not shaken. "I don't need their permission to lead." He crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, watching her carefully. "You've made it clear that I'm not just some human to you," he said. "But what does that mean, Zalari, when every eye in this place wants to see me gone?" She stood slowly, her movements careful from the soreness still hiding in her muscles. "It means I'll protect you until the day I can't," she answered without hesitation. "And when that day comes, I'll make sure they remember why I chose to protect you at all." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them no longer empty, but full of something unspoken. He walked closer, standing just a step away from her, and for the first time since the war began, her posture softened. "You're not who they think you are," he said. "You're more." She looked up at him with a mixture of pride and sorrow, as if his words hurt and healed her in the same breath. "No," she whispered. "I'm exactly who they fear I've become." Their connection deepened in the quiet moments, the shared glances, the hidden smiles, the long talks behind closed doors. But the base outside was shifting, coiling, preparing for something neither of them could see coming. A new commander from the outer fleet had been sent to observe her, General Vesk. Known for obedience and swift executions, he arrived in a black dropship with crimson banners, his face marked by metal implants and eyes cold as frozen steel. He watched Zalari with polite words and venom behind every compliment, and he watched Mason with something far worse than hatred, calculated interest. Mason could feel the pressure closing in, like walls narrowing around a fire. He wasn't a soldier, but he had survived enough to know when something deadly was near. He stayed close to Zalari, offering her presence not as protection, but as a reminder of what she had chosen. She accepted it, though each hour with him now felt like standing on a knife's edge. And when the reports came in that General Vesk had ordered a private meeting with her, she didn't flinch. She only said, "It begins now." The chamber assigned for the meeting was deep within the command wing, reinforced and shielded from all surveillance, but guarded heavily outside. Zalari entered alone, wearing full ceremonial armor, not out of pride, but as a message. She was not afraid of her own tradition. Inside, General Vesk stood motionless, his hands behind his back and his metallic jaw reflecting the soft blue lights overhead. He turned only when she stopped in front of him, offering her no greeting, only silence and observation. "You've grown sentimental," he finally said, his voice a mix of static and disdain. "And now the council doubts your purpose." Zalari remained still, her voice measured and cold. "I command with strength, not cruelty," she said. "You confuse defiance with decay." Vesk replied, circling her like a predator testing for weakness. "You've shown mercy to a human, made him a figure in your camp, and you stood in an arena and refused blood." His words struck like daggers. But Zalari did not flinch or look away. "I refused waste." Vesk stepped closer until only inches separated them. "I've been sent to correct you," he said with finality. "Either you dispose of the human and reaffirm your loyalty, or I take your position and bury your failure in ash." She didn't blink, didn't breathe deeply, only replied with calm steel in her tone. "You will not touch him," she said, not as a plea but a command. "And you will not take what I've built." Vesk smirked, the side of his face twitching where synthetic muscle met living skin. "Then you're not just defiant," he said. "You're dangerous." Without waiting for her to respond, he turned and exited the chamber, leaving behind a scent of ozone and threat. Zalari remained still for a long moment, then removed her gauntlet and clenched her injured hand. Pain reminded her she was alive, and that this battle was no longer about survival, it was about choice. And choices had consequences. Outside, Mason was already waiting, pacing slowly near the end of the corridor where guards refused to let him closer. When she exited, he looked at her face and knew something had shifted again. "He gave you an ultimatum," Mason said, watching her closely. She didn't answer at first, just kept walking with him silently down the hall. Then she whispered without looking at him, "He's coming for both of us." Her voice held no fear, only certainty. The next 2 days passed in preparation that no one spoke of openly. Zalari began reassigning guards, reviewing flight logs, and locking down parts of the base from internal access. Mason remained by her side, not because he was told to, but because he refused to hide. The other soldiers watched him now, not with confusion, but with suspicion. To them, he was the storm that had changed their leader and the reason their hierarchy was cracking. And to some, that made him a target. On the third night, someone tried to assassinate him. It happened in the barracks corridor while he was alone, heading to a ration post. The attacker was fast, cloaked in shadows, and wielded a thin vibroblade meant for clean, silent kills. Mason barely dodged the first strike and managed to disarm the assailant. Using broken piping from the wall, he didn't kill the attacker, only restrained him until backup arrived, blood trailing down his side from a shallow cut. When Zalari saw him, her face hardened into something unreadable. She didn't speak to the prisoner or ask who sent him, she already knew. Instead, she ordered the soldier to be taken to a cold cell and stripped of rank indefinitely. Later, when the base quieted, she sat with Mason in the med bay, wrapping his wound herself. "You could have died," she said without meeting his eyes. "But I didn't," he replied, wincing slightly. "Because of what you taught me." She paused, her hands resting gently on the bandage as her voice lowered. "They will keep coming," she whispered. "I know," Mason said, placing his hand on hers. "You're worth the risk," he added without hesitation. Zalari looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't hide what showed in her eyes. Gratitude, the failed assassination attempt changed everything inside the base. Loyalty no longer flowed in one direction, and the atmosphere thickened with silent tension. Zalari doubled the guards at Mason's quarters, but trusted none of them. She began her own private surveillance, rerouting internal feeds and watching even her oldest officers. The truth was now unavoidable. Her own command had fractured under the weight of her choice. And General Vesk had not left after the meeting. He had simply gone quiet. When Zalari returned to the arena for combat drills. She found her officers waiting not with weapons, but with hesitation. They followed her orders, but without the fire that once lit their eyes. Even her second-in-command, Vale, who had fought beside her for years, kept his distance. He spoke with respect, but lacked conviction, as though speaking to someone he no longer understood. She knew what they feared. It wasn't the human's presence, but what it meant. He had pierced the armor they all thought was unbreakable. Mason remained in the quarters given to him, a room that once belonged to a captured ambassador. It wasn't a cell, and yet it felt no different, because the threat had shifted from the outside to within. He wasn't afraid, but he was restless, aware of every movement beyond the walls. Every meal brought to him was tested by a trusted hand, and every breath inside that room was watched by silent eyes. Still, he never asked Zalari to remove him, never asked for freedom or safety. He chose to stay, not because he was trapped, but because he believed in her. One evening she visited him without guards or armor, wearing only the sleek fabric of her command robes. She sat without speaking, her hands folded in her lap, her expression distant. "I was trained to suppress everything," she said quietly. "Fear, doubt, grief, even love. They told us those things had no place in war." Mason listened, offering no interruption, only space for her to breathe. "But now you sit across from me, and I don't know who I am anymore." "You're not weaker," Mason replied after a pause. "You're just finally seeing what power feels like when it isn't forced." She looked at him sharply, searching his face for mockery or lies, and found neither. "I envy your courage," she admitted, voice rough but real. "You stepped into our world unarmed and still refused to bow. And somehow, that frightens them more than our weapons ever did." Before she could say more, the alert sirens wailed across the base. Zalari jumped to her feet, already issuing commands through her wrist console. Mason followed her to the control room, where holographic maps displayed an unauthorized breach. A squad led by General Vesk had seized the hangar bay and sealed the inner gates. He was making his move not with subtlety, but with force, using fear as his weapon. And his first target was obvious. "His orders are to execute you before sunrise," Zalari said as her officers scrambled for positions. "He means to stage a coup masked as an emergency protocol." She snapped orders to the guards still loyal to her. She turned to Mason and placed a small black cum chip in his hand. "This will lead you through the waste ducts to the outer ridge," she said. "But I'm not leaving," Mason responded instantly. She grabbed his arm with a grip strong enough to bruise. "I won't let them take you," she said, eyes blazing. "Then don't," he replied. "But don't ask me to run from your side either." There was a silence between them, thick with risk and resolve. She looked into his eyes, saw no fear, and finally gave a single nod. "Then we fight together," she said, voice steady. "Until the last moment. We stand." The night burned with chaos as loyalists clashed with traitors, inside steel corridors echoing with gunfire. Zalari led from the front, striking with lethal precision, her injuries forgotten. Mason stayed close, using scavenged weapons and cover, a shadow at her side. For every corridor they reclaimed, another fell behind them, but neither stopped moving. This wasn't just rebellion, it was cleansing, a purge of fear and weakness hiding behind tradition. And with every step forward, they reclaimed more than territory, they reclaimed purpose. The base had become a war zone under its own roof, with screams echoing through steel corridors once built for order. Zalari moved like fire, her twin blades flashing with deadly grace as she cut down another traitor attempting to block their path. Mason followed behind her with a salvaged blaster, his hands steady and his breath sharp with purpose. They had no backup, no promise of reinforcements, only each other and the truth they refused to abandon. Their bond, born in silence and tempered through trust, now guided them through every kill and corner. This wasn't just survival anymore, it was rebellion in the name of something deeper. General Vesk's men had taken control of the inner hangars, the main power node, and 2/3 of the outer barracks. But what they lacked was the loyalty of hearts, the kind Zalari still held among the few who remembered her sacrifice. Those soldiers began emerging one by one, choosing to stand beside her rather than behind a mutiny masked as tradition. In secret pockets and hidden halls, her name was still spoken with reverence and not fear. And every time one of them joined her, Zalari's voice grew stronger, her orders more certain. Mason watched as the legend of her command was reborn right before his eyes. They pushed through the lower levels, step by step reclaiming what once belonged to her. Each fight left her bleeding, but her posture never bent, never surrendered. Even when a blade pierced the gap in her shoulder guard, she tore it free and kept moving. Mason shielded her flank with furious precision, refusing to let anyone close enough to harm her again. Though not born to battle, he had become something more than a bystander. He had become a protector, and she had stopped pushing him away in the heat of a brief pause. They ducked into a sealed storage bay lit only by red emergency lights. Zalari dropped to one knee to reset a power terminal, her breathing shallow but focused. Mason knelt beside her, quickly binding the worst of her wounds using strips torn from his own uniform. "You bleed for people who once doubted you," he said, pressing fabric into her side. "I bleed because I won't let them decide who I am anymore." She replied without hesitation, "And I bleed because I still believe they're worth saving." The doors behind them sparked suddenly as explosives tore through the lock. Vesk's elite stepped in, all black armor and chrome rifles aimed straight at the two of them. Mason rose to shield her instinctively, but Zalari pushed him aside and stepped forward first. "You came for blood," she said to the squad leader, her voice a blade of its own. "But you serve a coward who hides while we fight for something real." The lead soldier hesitated, weapon trembling just enough to betray his doubt. "Lay down your arms," Zalari ordered, blood dripping down her forearm. The soldier looked at Mason, then at her, then lowered his weapon slowly to the floor. One by one, the others followed until the bay was quiet again, filled with the sound of surrendered metal clinking against steel. Mason exhaled, his chest tightening not from fear, but from awe. He had just witnessed not the death of a rebellion, but the rebirth of a ruler. Zalari didn't smile, but her eyes held a fire that hadn't burned this bright in years. Word spread fast after that moment, faster than bullets or commands. Zalari's troops began retaking command hubs, locking down key systems before Vesk could regroup. Her authority was no longer enforced through fear, but earned through the loyalty of those she bled beside. Mason stood at her side in every briefing, no longer treated as a prisoner or outsider. To some, he had become a symbol of her greatest mistake, but to many more, he was now the reason she'd become stronger, and even she had stopped denying it. But Vesk would not vanish quietly into defeat from the shadows of the upper citadel. He sent one last message, broadcast to the entire base. "Tomorrow, I reclaim what's mine." His voice growled through the speakers. "There will be no mercy for traitors, nor for those who follow them." Zalari stood before her troops. As the final message ended, her blade drawn and dripping with old blood. "We end this tomorrow," she said. Voice like thunder in silence. Asterisk, the final dawn rose above the Valkyren, base under a sky choked with smoke and the glow of burning ships. Zalari stood at the heart of the command courtyard, surrounded by her loyalists, each one ready to bleed for her command. Her armor bore the scars of the past nights, unpolished and cracked, yet more fearsome than ever. Mason stood beside her in a lightweight field suit, armed and alert, no longer a captive but a warrior in his own right. The courtyard gates trembled as the sound of Vesk's march approached, the clatter of boots like war drums echoing in steel. Today would decide everything. The gates burst open, and Vesk entered with his remaining forces. their black visors gleaming beneath red battle lights. He stepped forward alone, his blade drawn, and his face twisted in mechanical rage. "You were a legend, Zalari," he called out. "And now you're nothing but a traitor with a pet human." The insult hit the ears of her soldiers, but no one moved. No one flinched. Zalari took one step forward and raised her voice for all to hear. "I am more than legend, I am change." She walked to the center of the courtyard, her blade unsheathed and glowing with old energy. Vesk met her there without hesitation, and the crowd stepped back, forming a ring of silence around them. Neither spoke again as they circled each other, their weapons humming with energy and memory. The first strike came from Vesk, heavy and wide, but she ducked under it and slashed his side with swift precision. He roared and countered, blade sparking against hers in a flash of white heat. Their duel wasn't just strength versus strength, it was future against past. Mason stood ready, eyes scanning the perimeter for betrayal, but none came. Zalari's followers held the line, watching their leader fight not as a symbol, but as a soldier who earned their faith. Blow after blow shook the ground, and blood splattered against the stone with each wound traded. But Zalari moved with purpose, drawing on pain, truth, and something far older than protocol. Vesk began to slow, his movements fueled by hatred, but dulled by ego. And then she struck. True. Her blade pierced the joint in his plated chest and emerged through his back, humming with finality. Vesk gasped, trying to speak, but his voice failed as the strength drained from his limbs. Zalari withdrew her weapon and let him fall to his knees, before collapsing to the ground. The courtyard remained silent as she stood over his body, her chest rising with slow, steady breaths. She turned to her people, blood staining her armor and truth in her eyes. "This is the last time we fight ourselves." The soldiers saluted her in silence. Then one by one dropped to one knee, not from fear, but from respect. Zalari sheathed her blade and walked back to Mason, her posture tired but unbroken. He met her with steady hands and searching eyes, offering her the kind of support no rank could give. "You led them," he said, his voice low. "No," she corrected gently. "We led them, and together." They turned to face a base no longer divided. In the days that followed, the remnants of Vesk's supporters were disarmed and offered a choice: serve or leave. Most chose to stay, changed not by punishment, but by the power of seeing their leader bleed with purpose. The council remained silent, too shaken by the uprising to issue orders or shame. Whispers across other Vakiran colonies spoke of what had happened, and many began to question what strength truly meant. Zalari never sought to control the narrative, she let the truth carry itself like wind through dry leaves. She had already won something no command ever had before: loyalty without fear. Mason remained by her side, no longer watched or guarded, but welcomed. He trained with her soldiers, walked her halls, and became the voice she trusted when her own faltered. Though many still looked at him as an outsider, none dared challenge his place at her side, because he had not just earned her respect, he had held her secrets when she could not, and that made him untouchable in ways no title ever could. Not by force, but by faith. One evening, beneath the stars above the rebuilt command tower, Zalari removed her armor and stood beside Mason in silence. He looked at her, and for the first time, she looked back, not as a commander, not as a warrior, but simply as herself. "You once said I confused you," he said with a quiet smile. "You still do," she replied, stepping closer. "But now I welcome it." And beside the human who never betrayed her truth, the warrior who swore never to show weakness finally let herself feel peace.